Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. I'm working on one in regards to the seven liberal arts, the school of Chartres, and how these ancient cathedrals, very much in the sense that ancient temples were universities and libraries, and we tend to think of a cathedral as strictly as a purely religious building, but for instance Chartres, Cologne, Clermont-Ferrand, and these other great cathedrals were universities of their time, storehouses of knowledge where people learnt the sciences, as we would call them. Essentially, they were universities. But the Masonic tradition, because of the strong connection between the early craft guilds, stone masons, the alchemists, the highly skilled carpenters, metal workers who put so much effort into building these great buildings, and this is just again a part of an ancient tradition. So if you go back to the Greco-Roman temples, Mesopotamian, all the way back to Egypt, for instance, in Heliopolis, you see that these places are centers of learnings, and the geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music is so important throughout time, really. And now, for instance, the stained glass in Chartres is another example of this, but it honors the masons who built these cathedrals, and the compass and the square, for instance, and how important the geometry, the metrology, to get these buildings perfect and harmonious, and to, for instance, the height to the width to the length would be tuned to make it acoustic properties as well, which is another feature so important to these sacred spaces. Naiology is also a term for the study of sacred architecture. If you go back to the Roman times, and we see, so whether it was surveyors and the highly skilled masons would often have tombstones and would be honoured, and these symbols of the compass and the square, the ruler, the mallet, for instance, being symbols throughout time. This is an example of it's cut in stone, but it honours the tools that the masons were so depended upon to do this great work. Again, from Egypt throughout time. That's a merker. This is a time. This is for measuring time at night. But the feature of this video will be on the plumb line. So here we see an example of a plumb line. It's just a string with a weight on it, which applies to pendulums. And recently, and for quite some time, I've been posting on the importance of measuring time via the pendulum, which also requires measuring length. And so, for instance, in this tool, this also uses a plumb line, a pendulum. We'll get some better examples of that. Here are some from ancient Egypt tools. Now, these are not Old Kingdom. These were probably Ptolemaic, or maybe a little bit earlier. But again, the practical use of these tools themselves. So this is a builder's square, but it's also a way of measuring horizontal. So you would put this on the horizon of the block, and the plumb line would stick right down the middle. And if it was off, just like a bubble in a level, the plumb line would be off, and therefore you knew it wasn't on the level. This is an instrument for measuring the vertical, to get your buildings in the right particular angle. And of course, like the builder square. But so the use of a plumb line again goes back, being recorded and it is a very simple tool, but it will give you level. And that's why one of the reasons it's so important. And you can also, you start swinging the plumb line, you also have a pendulum to measure time. So this was an instrument of a merkit, but the ancient plumb line, plumb bobs, we find so many examples across all of Egyptian history. Now, these tools might not surviving wooden pieces extend back that time, but we do find examples of the plumb line going back to the oldest strata there. But also, this is because these Masonic tools are still embedded in, stonemasons, brick masons, tilers, etc. would have to use these, and still have to. Maybe now they use a laser bore, but we still see in Masonic tracing the compass, the builder's square, the level. So this is a modern one, and they're showing it in a more modern aspect. But the plumb line, once again, and how important the plumb line and the plummet is, because these more modern Masonic emblems go back through time to the great cathedrals, and of course Greco-Roman, all the way through these ancient civilizations back to Egypt. This is a more traditional mason board, but the same thing, we see a level. So this instrument would measure the horizontal, this instrument would measure the vertical. to prove, that it's on the level, it's square. And of course, we have the builder's square, the compass, the ruler. These are all, again, compasses and rulers, straight edge, and the levels. But of course, this is actually all in biblical tradition. So Isaiah, behold, I am laying in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. He who believes will not be in haste. And this relates to cornerstone ceremonies. Now, in recent years, recent couple centuries, this is purely a Masonic thing. But if you go back to the ceremonies in regards to temple foundations, such as in regards to Shesset in ancient Egypt, and again throughout time, the importance of this cornerstone. And again, it's very ancient, it's very biblical, and it's still with us today. This is a cornerstone ceremony where they use a builder's square to make sure the it is square, and then they would use these plumb lines. So it's just a plumb line hanging down, and that would give you your true horizontal. Builder's square and the horizontal level on the level. And we see that these instruments are still very important. And we also have this instrument, which is a plumb bob to measure the vertical of to be true. Is your building true? And again, this is very biblical in that sense, because the next part would be, and I will make justice the line and righteousness for plummet, a plumb line. That's a weight on a string. And does he who plows for plough continually, does he continually open a row on his ground? This is another cool thing in regards to temple foundations and city foundations. They would plough a furrow and to mark the sacred precinct, and they would put cornerstones in the middle. But when he has leveled its surface, okay, it's just a bit out there, does he scatter the cumin, plough in wheat in rows, barley? Now, whether it's wheat, barley, and these other grains, these are also ancient uses for weights and measures. For instance, a gold ounce, when you hear the price of gold, they don't measure that in the normal food ounce. That's called the troy ounce, which is 480 grain. Gunpowder is still measured in grains, but also 3 barley corn is equal to an inch. So these sacred grains are also the basis for weights and measures too, which is so important feature. And because throughout the Bible, I've done some earlier videos on that, whether it's the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Bible, Magna Carta, Code of Hammurabi, they speak very often in a moral sense about the accuracy of weights and measures, but also in a moral sense as well. And so these traditions have been passed on. But righteousness for plummet, which is just the plumb line. And again, Amos 7, he showed me, behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line, and with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? A plumb line. Behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. So again, in biblical tradition, you'll now this of course is a more modern illustration, but it is written in so a lot of what this is evil, spooky Mason stuff is built on ancient traditions, ancient Egyptian, biblical, Code of Hammurabi, even up to the Magna Carta. And well, okay, that's a brick mason or a stone mason. Well, they're still using these lines. It's a very simple, very profound, very elegant tool. This is again the Merkit timekeeping device. So with a plumb line to get it straight, and then you could measure the movement of stars throughout the night. And so a sundial only works through the day, but you could also use a movement of stars per night to measure time. And again, just an example of these plumb lines. Book of the Dead, Book of Coming Forth, some other names as well, but spell 125, again, I've not reduced the measuring vessel, measuring cord, I've not encroached on the fields, I've not added to the pan of the scales, I've not tampered with the plumb bob of the scales. Okay, in the UN building, especially if you watch Secrets in Plain Sight by Scott Onstock, great series, must watch, but he talks about the symbolism in the UN building. Also, I might add that this is on 42nd Avenue, and that's what they call Manhattanhenge, which is an astronomical alignment. Now, along 42nd Avenue, you have a series of very important buildings built by the numbers. Grand Central Station, which includes all the measures and the symbols in there as well. I did a whole series on New York, but for instance, this is another mural in the UN building, and again we see the plumb line above the earth as well. So these elements of truth, but across various traditions. Builders, traditional builders' tools, astronomers, these are the plumb line, which of course is another, it can also be applied to a pendulum. And again, Isaiah, but again, the precious cornerstone. So the stone the builders rejected. Now in ancient Greek, Hebrew, that's 273 anyway, but the perfect stone is the stone the builders rejected. That's again, very biblical theme. And leveling the surface, and this will also incorporate, so New Jerusalem, all by the numbers, lovely numbers, and if you convert the measures, it's just one of these things in the use of measuring grains, to measure length, to measure weight, and the morality codes in biblical, ancient Egyptian, Code of Hammurabi, blah, blah, blah. And yes, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone. So these cornerstone ceremonies, and okay, even John Dee. Now this is the measuring rod. So the caduceus literally was a measuring wand given to Hermes by Apollo. It's a wand, and that's the ancient Greek. Wand is a measuring rod, and then the two snakes later. But there's moral codes and there's measuring codes in there. And you also see it, for instance, in John Dee, and talking about the Enochian magic, for instance, as in Enoch, but also Solomon and the Psalms. They're magical spells. That's like an interesting, because John Dee, Enochian magic, got it directly from there. Then not such a good guy, but Crowley, reinterpreted that, but he was building this off these old traditions, and again throughout the old books you'll find it. So plumb lines or pendulums all connect together. The stonemasons traditions and Freemasons, they have similar origins in the craft guilds. Their rituals are built around biblical tradition, but also biblical tradition just really emerged from old. It was not born of a vacuum. It was, so a lot of the church mass is really, it's pagan in that sense, and so much of that's but so if you want to use the Masonic symbolism, Bible symbolism and moral codes, and ancient Egyptian Babylonian traditions are built in this very practical sense, and what is true is on the level. Even so, it's a square house, it's on the level. These Masonic terms, as in Freemasons, yes, which is a modern moral code, but they are built on ancient building codes. So the same with Tubal Cain, for instance, in the Bible as well, talks about the copper and stone and woodwork, and these plumb lines, and because it's true, a plumb line will hang straight down, and you can use it to measure and to be very accurate. So I speak a lot about measures, but there is a moral aspect to these things that is worth looking into, and it is part of a continuous ancient tradition, because the compass, the plumb line, they're true, they work, and this is one of the reasons why these symbols are in there. Okay, with that, I'm working on something else, but just because I had these ready-made from an older video, and I thought it'd be worth just making a single one on the plumb line and the builder square and the compasses, for instance, and how they are part, again, continuous ancient tradition with very practical purpose, but also with moral connotations, and that's why it's so important. And I think that there's a lot of, okay, I don't want to probably get where I'm saying, but a lot of this stuff is being made to be evil, and well, it's very easy to throw that word around, especially if you don't know the background of it, and if you want to use a biblical sense to say these things are evil, well, it's actually in the Bible, and what's in the Bible is in other ancient texts. So bit of a problem there. But anyway, with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.